Hi, my name is Chasta Musenda, and I want to thank you for listening to today's message. I hope this message challenges you to know Christ, experience community, and influence culture.
When you were a kid, if you grew up in church, you might have attended this thing called Sunday school. Sunday school was typically happened an hour before the church service on Sunday morning, and Sunday school was basically an hour where you went to a class based on whatever your age group was, and you learned different stories from the Bible. And if you went to Sunday school as a kid, you may have heard stories about Noah and the ark, or Moses and the Israelites, or David and Goliath. And as you went, that kind of became that grounding place where you begin to discover what Scripture teaches. And so they called it Sunday school because it happened on Sunday, and it was like school. And your textbook was the Bible. And I don't know why we called it Sunday school, because most kids hated school, but we called it Sunday school, right? So hopefully that didn't scar anyone too bad. Well, last summer we did a series called Old School Sunday School. And we looked at some of the stories from Scripture that we find in the Old Testament. And we decided, hey, let's bring that up today. And so last summer we did Old School Sunday School. This summer we're going to do Old School Sunday School Volume 2. Yeah. So we're going to take a look at a few more heroes from the Old Testament and lessons we can learn from their life and what those mean for us today. So to start us off, we're going to tackle the story of Abraham. Now, Abraham's original name was not Abraham. His original name was actually Abram. And you find a story in the Old Testament book of Genesis. Abram was born in a land called Ur of the Chaldeans. It is what is present-day Iraq. When the Chaldeans were a tribe of people, they actually worshipped multiple gods. In fact, Abram, or Abraham's father, Terah, actually worshipped a dozen different idols during his lifetime. But Abram actually came to be known as the father of faith. In fact, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 6, this is what it says: Abraham, our father of faith, believed God, and the substance of his faith released God's righteousness to him. So why was Abraham called the father of faith? Here's why. Abram married Sarah. Abram and Sarah had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. One day, Jacob is basically having a wrestling match with God, and God changes Jacob's name to Israel. Israel had 12 sons. You following me? Those 12 sons became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, thus making Abram the father of many nations. One of those sons was named Judah. Judah, the head of the tribe of Judah. And who came out of the tribe of Judah? Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And so Jesus' line, his line traces all the way back to Abraham. In fact, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, we see the genealogy of Jesus laid out. This is what it says. Verse 1, this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. So Abraham is the father of faith. The bloodline, it traces back to him. But when you take a closer look at his story, you discover that Abraham was not only the father of faith, he also lived a life of faith. And that's where I want to turn our attention this morning. Because from his life, we discover some keys to building faith in our own lives. He was not only the father of faith, he lived a life of faith, and those lessons impact us today. Here's the first lesson we learned from Abram. Faith begins with God. Now that sounds incredibly obvious. It's like, thank you, Stephen, for not telling me anything I didn't already know. Okay, no, faith begins with God. Here's what I want you to see. In Genesis 12, God comes to Abram with some very specific instructions. This is what he says. The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. Notice in that passage, 5 times you have a reference to the Lord. At the center of Abram's life, you get this picture. You realize that there is the Lord at the center of his faith. The idols that were part of Abram's upbringing, they were not the heart of his faith. Abram's own abilities and skills were not at the heart of his faith. No, the Lord was at the heart of Abram's faith. That's where faith begins. It starts with God. In fact, if you read Hebrews chapter 11, Hebrews is found in the New Testament. If you read Hebrews chapter 11, that chapter is often referred to as the chapter of faith. And in that chapter of faith, you find story after story after story of people from the Old Testament who lived lives of faith. You find stories about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Rahab and others as well. And at the center of all of them, of their faith, was the Lord. Please hear me. Faith does not begin with what you're believing God for. Okay, hear me. This is so important. Sometimes you'll hear people say, man, I'm just believing God to bless my business. I'm just believing God to provide this need. I'm just believing God to do X, Y, and Z. I'm just believing God for fill in the blank. That's not where faith begins. Faith does not begin with what you're believing God for. Faith begins with God Himself. It's a relationship at the core of faith, not the thing you hope your faith will bring to you. Faith begins with God. Number 2, faith requires vision. Faith requires vision. Look again, Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3. It's a passage we just read. The Lord says to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. He tells him to hey, leave and go. I'm sending you, and this is the it's like God says, this is the place, but I'm not going to tell you the place. He sends him to a land. Here's what I want you to see. God gives Abram a vision to start a family. From that family would come the nation of Israel. And from that nation, God would bless the entire world through the Messiah. But there was only one problem. God gives Abram the vision. The problem was his wife Sarah was childless. She was childless. Now think about this for a moment. Has God ever called you to do something or go somewhere, and everything inside of you said, excuse me, God, but I don't know if you've noticed, this is impossible. This can't happen, God. You don't understand my circumstances, God. I can imagine that's what's going through Abram's mind. God, this is great, but you don't understand. My wife, she hadn't had any babies yet, and it's not looking too good. But God had a divine plan since before Abram was even born. And God imprinted that divine plan on Abram's life, hear me, hear me, hear me. He imprinted it on his life when Abram's parents gave him his name. Why? Because the name Abram means exalted father. And when God, a few chapters later, changes Abram's name to Abraham, the name Abraham means father of many nations. Now, there's a part of me that wonders, did Abram say to God, God, time out, this is a cruel joke. Why am I named exalted father and we're childless? Why are you changing my name to father of many nations when we don't have any kids? How can I be what you are calling me? Hear me, this is so important for us today. Do not underestimate God's audacity to give you a vision that's bigger than your circumstances right now. God can do that. God will do that. And that vision requires faith. And faith requires vision. Why does faith require vision? Because faith always pushes you outside of your comfort zone to pursue something bigger than yourself. That's where the vision is born. And when that vision comes, it's going to require you to take the next step. Number 3, faith takes action. Faith takes action. Now, God gave Abram the what? He gave him the vision. But he did not give him the how. Ever been there? Some of you in the room are what people? You've always got a dream. You've always got a vision. And others of you in the room are how people. You just want to know, how's it going to happen? How's it going to work? And have you ever noticed what people and how people don't always get along? The what people are frustrated by the how people because they're casting this bold, outrageous vision, this dream for the future. And the how people are going, yeah, but how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? Where are you going to get the money? How are you going to make that happen? Who's going to help you? Blah, 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 blah. And the what people just want to say, shut up. They're just saying, you are the devil, right? I mean, you are the thorn in my flesh right now. The how people are over here, and they're so practical. And man, they can chart the course to make things happen. But if they don't have a what person in their life, they won't know where to chart the course to. Hear me. Every what needs a how. Every how needs a what. And some of you are whats and some of you are hows. Figure out what you are and find the other and work together. Now, I got off my notes. Sorry, I just got in a moment there. God tells Abram what to do, but he doesn't tell him how to do it. And when we have the what, but we don't have the how, our tendency is to stand still. And we do nothing. Look what happens. The very next verse, verse 4. Abram's been told the what? He's been told, hey, this is what I want you to do. Abram doesn't ask God how. Instead, Abram departed as the Lord had instructed. And Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Let that thought sink in just for a moment. Abram was 75 years old when he departed. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. Notice, when God called Abram, it required him to depart. He had to depart the land that he knew He had to depart his relatives and his friends and his neighbors. And hear me. And he had to depart 75 years of history. Most of us at 75 aren't thinking about departing everything we know. Right? We find comfort in what we know. We find comfort in where we live. We find comfort in the relationships we have. We find comfort in what we know. So imagine, here's Abram. God shows up and says, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I want you to do. I'm not going to tell you how. I just want you to know what to do. And I know you're 75, but let's go. Faith always takes action. In fact, if you read Abraham's story in the faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, I want you to notice what it says in verse 8. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed. When God called him to leave home and go to another land, that God would give him as his inheritance, he went without knowing where he was going. Sign me up, God. That's usually not our response, is it? Hear me. You cannot step into your destiny for tomorrow unless you depart from something today. Every destiny requires a departure. Every destiny requires a departure. Every dream requires a departure. Our problem is, hear me, we are so focused on the good we're leaving that we can't step into the destiny that God has for us. And I get it, right? Because we know what we have right now. But when God calls us into something new, we don't know everything there is to know about that something new. We only know what we have right now. And here's the strange part of human nature. We would rather live with bad circumstances than unknown good circumstances. Because we say to ourselves, well, at least I know what I got. And even though it ain't much, and even though things could be a lot better, we're fixated on the bad we know so much that we can't step into the good that is unknown. But I want you to understand, whatever God calls you to, whatever it is, whatever is involved, however great it, I'm telling you, you will have to depart something. You will have to give up something, leave behind something in order to step into it. You've probably heard this before. A lot of times, whenever someone is leaving an organization, they're leaving a business, they're leaving a company, they're leaving a ministry, whatever it is that they're leaving, a lot of times when people are leaving something, they don't have something to go to. So the entire time after they leave, they're doing this. And then sometimes they back up and say, let me meddle. If you're going to leave, leave. But the only way to leave is to know what you're going to. And when God calls you to something new, some of you here today, God is calling you to something new, a vision for the future, something that He's stirring in your heart, some need you feel called to meet, some problem you feel called to solve, some dream you feel called to pursue. Like God's stirring something inside of you, but you don't want to let go of what you've got right now in order to pursue what He has for you. Every destiny requires a departure. In fact, if you go to the New Testament, James says it like this, James 2:17. Faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is what? dead. It's a dead faith. There has to be movement. There has to be action. And then the Apostle Paul, he said it like this: for we live by faith, not by sight. Think about that for a moment. We live by sight generally, what I can see. And Paul says, no, you've got it backward. No, the posture of your heart is one of faith. The posture of I was about to say fart. The posture of your heart. Moving right along. The posture of your heart is faith, not what you can see. So often we want to see the end result before we leave the present reality. And yet it rarely works that way. I think Marla Runyon is a perfect example of this. Between 1992 and 1999, Marla Runyon won 5 gold medals in the Paralympics Games. Then in 2000 and in 2004, she qualified for the U.S. Olympic team. But what makes her story unique is that Marla was the first legally blind person to compete in the Olympic Games. She placed 8th in the 1,500-meter event in Sydney, Australia. How did she do it? Being legally blind, she used her very limited peripheral vision to help guide her. And although she could not see how far she had run during the race, she would listen to the intensity of the other runners' breaths to help her pace herself. She was interviewed one day, and in the interview, the interviewer asked how she could run toward a finish line that she couldn't even see. I love her response. She said, "I can't see it, but I know it's there." Yeah. That's faith. I can't see it, but I know it's there. You see, faith is realizing, hey, I'm going to have to take a step in the direction of the thing that God is calling me to. And even though I can't see it, I know it's there because the Lord has called me to it. I know. And I've got a lot of questions and not very many answers. But I know. And therefore I'll move. Number 4. Fourth lesson we learn from Abraham is faith resists fear. Now, notice I did not say that faith has no fear, okay? Hear me. If God calls you to do something, if God's stirring something new in your heart to pursue, it's normal to have fear. I mean, fear is just part of the game. It's just part of the deal. You're going to have unanswered questions. You're going to have things that you're just like, I don't know how this is going to turn out. Fear is going to come anytime you're stepping out by faith. Even for the father of faith. Because when you read Abram's story, after he's taken this step to leave everything he's known for 75 years, after he's taken this step to leave it and to pursue what God has called him to pursue, a war breaks out between several kings. Basically, 4 kings all teamed up together to do battle with 5 other kings who all teamed up to do battle. And when these kings team up to do battle with one another, in this battle, Abram's nephew, Lot, is captured. And when Abram finds out that Lot has been captured, he mobilizes 318 trained men to go rescue him. And that's exactly what they do. They go and they not only rescue Lot, but they also rescue other captives, and they basically get back all the possessions that had been stolen from Abram. After this happens, you might think Abram's thinking, dude, we got it. No, what Abram now had, yes, he had his nephew back. Yes, other captives were back. Yes, his possessions were back. But now he had 9 kings mad at him. So what happens? Abram deals with fear. Like, are they going to retaliate? Are they coming after me? But look at how God responds to Abraham's fear. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1. Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great." The New International Version says it like this: "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. I am your shield." A shield was a defensive tool. And in those days, a shield was typically made of either wood or leather and metal. So when God said, "I am your shield, Abram," he was saying, Abram, listen, time out. Listen, I know you're scared. You don't have to be afraid. And let me tell you why you don't have to be afraid, Abram. Because your shield is not made of wood, leather, and metal. Your shield is made of my presence. And my presence will protect you. Now, here's where it gets good. If you go to the New Testament, the Apostle Paul addresses a shield. And look what Paul says in Ephesians 6, verse 18. In all circumstances, take up the what? Shield of what? Faith. The shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. Now, why would he say that? He said that because in those days, armies would take their arrows, dip them in a substance that was flammable, light the arrows on fire, and then shoot them off at their enemy, hoping to do the greatest amount of damage. So what Paul is saying is, hey, you have an enemy. His name is Satan. He is the enemy of your soul, and he operates the same way. He will fire his darts, his arrows of destruction at you. And they will not just be arrows, they will be flaming arrows. He has dipped them in the substance of his deception. He has dipped them in the substance of his lies. He has dipped them in the substance of destruction, and he will fire them out you with one aim, and that is to destroy you. Now, Paul doesn't leave it at that, though. It's like, good luck. He says, hey, but you've got a shield of faith. And you know what's amazing is in those days, a shield, like we think of a shield kind of like Captain America's shield. You know what I'm talking about? Like it's, this round shield and it's good and you can maneuver it. A shield in those days was 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Meaning it was big enough to cover all of you. So Paul's saying, hey, listen, your shield of faith, it's big enough to cover all of you. The shield of faith that you have, hey, it's big enough to extinguish not 80% of the arrows, not 90%. It's big enough to extinguish 100% of the arrows the enemy fires at you. It is a shield of faith. And when should we take up the shield of faith? When should we place our faith, our trust in God? Paul said, in all circumstances. In all circumstances. I can think of no better circumstance to place your faith and trust in God in than when you are afraid. Faith resists fear. Fear will come. That's normal. That's part of the game. But when you place your faith in the Lord, when you say, I'm going to trust you, God, even though I don't have all the answers, even though 9 kings are against me, I'm still going to choose what seems illogical and irrational. I'm going to choose faith. I'm going to choose to trust you, God, in the midst of this circumstance. You're making a statement to God, God, you are my source. And you're making a statement to the enemy, you will not win this battle.
Yes.
Because my faith is in the one who already defeated you at the cross. When Jesus went to the cross and he died on the cross, he hung on that cross, he was crucified, nailed to that cross. It wasn't because he just ticked off a bunch of people. It's because he was paying the penalty you and I cannot pay on our own. The penalty for our sin, which deserves death. But not only did he pay the penalty of our sin, hear me, he robbed its power. He robbed its power. He robbed the power of your enemy, of your spiritual enemy, the devil. He robbed his power. He stripped his authority. Is our faith in him? Is our faith in the work of Jesus at the cross that is far greater than the fear the enemy would love to drench you in? I love something that author John Gordon said about the difference between faith and fear. This is what he said. He said, faith and fear have one thing in common. They both believe in a future that hasn't happened yet. Fear believes in a negative future. Faith believes in a positive future. If neither has happened yet, why wouldn't we choose to believe in a positive future? Why wouldn't we choose to believe our best days are ahead of us instead of behind us? Wow. It's when we take up the shield of faith, we make a declarative statement. The battle has been won in the powerful, undefeated name of the King of the universe, and his name is Jesus. One last thing. One last lesson we learn from Abraham, and that is that faith rests on God's promises. Faith rests on God's promises. You see, Abram struggled with 2 emotions. Fear was the first one. We just talked about that. But there was a second one. The second emotion he dealt with was discouragement. Discouragement. Now, why would Abram be discouraged? Well, if you look at Genesis 15, you see the discouragement in action. It says, but Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Hear me, he's basically lamenting, God, you gave me this promise. You said this is what was going to happen. But nothing's happening, God. Because, hear me, Abram went years and years and years and years before he ever had a son. So he's basically in the middle. You know what I'm saying? Like there's always 3 points in everything, right? There's the beginning when you're excited. I'm going to charge the mountain, right? And then there's always the end where hopefully you're standing on top of the mountain, but then there's the middle. And in the middle, you're far enough from the excitement of the vision when it was launched, but still far enough where you can't see the mountaintop yet. The middle is where Abram is in this. He's saying, God, where are you? Then he comes up with a human solution. Ooh, that's a whole nother sermon. How many times when God's not working on our timeline do we inject the human solution to help God out? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. That's Abram's solution. So get the picture. He's discouraged. He's saying, God, you gave me this vision for a family, but nothing has happened. So what does God do? What does God do? God reminds him of his promise. Look what he says, verse 4, Genesis 15. Then the Lord said to him, no. Don't you love that? Nope. Ain't going to happen that way. Nope. Nope. No. Your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, well, let me just pause and say this. He didn't just speak to him. He gave him an object lesson. He didn't just speak to him. He made it visual. Look what he does. The Lord took Abram outside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars, if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. That's what I'm going to do, Abram. Go ahead, count them. I'll wait. Count them. Count them if you can, Abram. Because that's what I'm about to do. Now, this isn't the only time that God reminds Abram of his promise. If you actually back up a couple chapters to Genesis chapter 13, verse 6, he says it this way. He says, and I will give you so many descendants that, like the dust of the earth, they cannot be counted. What was God doing? God was saying, Abram, listen up. Whether you look up in the sky or you look down at the ground, I'm going to remind you of my promise to you. You can look up at the sky all night long, and I'm going to remind you, I've got a promise for you, Abram. I've got a promise. Every star is a reminder of my promise. I can't look up anymore. Okay, start counting the dirt. Start counting the grains. And I'm going to remind you, I have a promise for you. Look up, look down. My promise will stand. You will be reminded of my promise. So let me ask you, where do you look in your discouragement to remind yourself God has a promise and he will keep his promise to you? Where do you look? Do you look at the news? Bad option. Do you listen to your negative friends? Bad option. Do you look at all the negativity surrounding the circumstance? Bad option. Where do you look to remind yourself of the promise of God? Look to his word. His word is eternal. His word is truth. His word is chock full of his promises. Let me wrap up with this. At the age of 30, Russell Kelso Carter had a critical heart condition, and he found himself on the brink of death. At that moment in his life, he knelt on his knees and he made a promise to God. And his promise to God was this: God, whether I live or I die, God, I consecrate myself to you. I'm yours, God. You have all of me. You have all of me. From that moment on, Scripture suddenly took on a whole new life in Russell's life. Despite the severity of his heart condition, he began to not only see the promises of God and to lean on the promises of God, he actually began to believe the promises of God. He didn't just read them and say, well, that's nice for somebody else. No, he took hold of the promises. He held on to them. He claimed them as his own. Well, Stephen, are you talking about a name it, claim it faith where you just, wheel it, deal it, blab it, grab it? Is that what you're talking about? No. No. Hear me. These are God's promises for you, for me, for his children. And he keeps them, and he's faithful to them. Things don't always look the way we think they should look. Sometimes we don't understand the ways of God. But what I know is I can read his word and find promises and say, God, I'm not just going to read that for someone else. I'm going to believe that. I'm going to lean on that. Russell lived another 49 years. Diagnosed at age 30, lived 49 years. And after personally experiencing the profound promises of God, one day he sat down and he wrote a hymn. And these are the words to that hymn. Standing on the promise of Christ my King, through eternal ages, let his praises ring. Glory in the highest, I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. What did Russell do? He believed these promises, these beautiful promises we find in his word. That raises a question. How did Abram respond when God told him in his discouragement, start counting the stars. Start counting the stars. This is how Abram responds in verse 6. And Abram believed the Lord. And the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. You know what that word believed means in that passage? That word believed means to lean your whole weight upon. It's saying, God, these promises of yours are strong enough to support the weight of my life. God, these promises are strong enough to support my circumstances, my pain, my hardship, what I'm going through right now. Your promises, God, like my stuff isn't too big for your promises. My pain and hardship, not too big for your promises. So instead of putting my weight, my faith, my trust in what's happening around me, I'm going to put it on your promises. And I'm going to trust you. Abraham's life was the ultimate expression of trust and faith. So we learn faith begins with God. Faith requires vision. Faith takes action. Faith resists fear. Faith rests on God's promises. But it all begins with God. Let's pray.
Thanks so much for listening to this message. If you'd like to learn more about Seven City Church, you can visit sevencitychurch.com. Or if you're in the Fort Worth area, we'd love to invite you to our Sunday service. God bless you and have a great day.